A little girl mysteriously vanished right from her bed. Her sister, with whom she shared the bed, shared an unusual story about how a mysterious stranger in an enchanting hat took the girl away. Despite some clues that the police managed to gather, the case remained unsolved for 35 years until the truth was finally unveiled, sparking a storm of public outrage. Jessica Qutierrez was born on December 3, 1981, in South Carolina, USA, and was the youngest child in the family, having two sisters and a brother. Following her parents' divorce soon after her birth, her mother, Debbie, faced the challenge of raising four children alone. They lived in the small town of Edmond, a few miles from the state capital, under circumstances where the mother had to provide for the family on her own, which was not easy. Nonetheless, despite the modest circumstances, the family maintained strong bonds of friendship and support. While Debbie worked, the older children looked after Jessica, and in her free time, the mother tried to find interesting activities for them. On June 5, 1986, a typical summer day, 4-year-old Jessica was playing in the yard with her siblings while their mother was busy with household chores. In the evenings, Jessica usually slept in the same bed as her mother since she was the youngest, but that day her brother had an earache, and Debbie decided that he would sleep with her. Thus, Jessica ended up in a room with her sisters, where the older sister slept separately and the younger one shared the bed with Jessica. At dawn the next day, Debbie woke up around 9 a.m. Rebecca, her 6-year-old daughter, who had slept with Jessica, approached her with a request to prepare a breakfast of cereal. Getting out of bed, the woman left the bedroom and immediately noticed alarming signs. The front door of the house, which she always locked at night, was wide open. The family dog, usually kept outside, was running around the house. A fallen curtain rod lay under the back window, and the protective mosquito net had been removed from the window. Approaching her daughter's room, Debbie did not find Jessica there. Papers were scattered on the floor. Asking the older children about their sister's whereabouts, she heard from Rebecca about the girl's absence and that a man in a magical hat with a beard had taken her. Thinking Rebecca was joking, Debbie began searching for Jessica, assuming she might have gone outside. Not finding her either outside or inside the house, the mother returned to her daughters and insisted that Rebecca tell her where her sister had disappeared. The girl consistently repeated her story about the man in the magical hat, causing Debbie to become distraught. In despair, she asked why Rebecca did not scream or call for help if she saw someone taking her younger sister. Eventually, Rebecca shared details of what happened. According to her, she woke up at night and saw a man in a wizard's hat with a beard carefully lifting the sleeping Jessica and leaving the room with her. Rebecca, who was only 6 years old, could not fully grasp the situation, became scared and hid under the blanket, thinking it was all just a terrible dream. After a short moment, she fell asleep again and did not tell her mother about the incident in the morning. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Debbie immediately contacted law enforcement. Upon arrival, police conducted a detailed inspection of the home and concluded that Jessica's abduction seemed quite likely, especially considering that the intrusion was apparently made through the guest window, from which the mosquito net had been removed. Upon closer inspection of the surroundings of the window, officers found a fingerprint on the glass, which was immediately sent for analysis, as well as a pack of cigarettes and several cigarette butts near the site of this presumed entry. Understanding that they were likely facing a case of abduction, detectives decided to install a recording device on Debbie's home phone in anticipation that the kidnapper might call with a ransom demand. Rebecca shared her story with the police again, this time clarifying that the intruder had turned off the fan and the nightlight before approaching their bed. Since a detailed description of the kidnapper's face could not be provided, the investigation focused on questioning Debbie, who was brought to the station for a more detailed account of the events of the previous day. During the conversation, Debbie speculated about who might be behind her daughter's disappearance. She recalled a recent breakup with a man she had been seeing for several months. According to her, he showed aggression and often consumed alcohol. She suspected that in light of their recent separation, he might have kidnapped her daughter as a form of revenge. Debbie called him directly from the police station, but the man denied any involvement in Jessica's disappearance. The police took steps to verify his alibi, but no evidence of his involvement in the crime was found. A theory involving Jessica's father was also checked, but it was discovered that he lived in another state and did not have the physical means to commit the abduction. While specialists checked the fingerprint found on the window glass through the FBI database, they found no matches, prompting law enforcement to refocus on a direct search for the missing child. The police conducted extensive search operations in the area surrounding Jessica's home, located on the edge of the town with agricultural lands stretching around its perimeter. Police officers thoroughly examined abandoned buildings, plantations, bodies of water, and other secluded places where the girl might be hiding. The next day, FBI agents joined the search, but no traces of Jessica were found. The distribution of flyers expanded to neighboring towns and across the state. The sheriff organized an aerial survey of the territory, but even these efforts yielded no results. Debbie was exhausted by worry and despair, staying at home with her 3 children and unable to join the search. She received information about the progress of the investigation from the police only sporadically. 2 days after the disappearance on Saturday, Debbie asked the sheriff about continuing the search over the weekend. The conversation was extremely emotional. Debbie expressed her dissatisfaction with the perceived inaction, to which the sheriff sharply responded, claiming that he had conducted searches all night and warned that further accusations could lead to the cessation of the search operation. Since Debbie's home phone continued to record all conversations, she preserved this conversation as evidence. With each passing day, Debbie lost more hope that her daughter would be found, believing the police efforts were insufficient. This situation lasted for many months until an unexpected turn occurred in the investigation. 10 weeks after the girl's mysterious disappearance, the police were faced with a wave of new crimes. A local resident broke into a private home, but the owner, armed, forced the intruder to flee. The criminal then took a van and headed to North Carolina, where he broke into a woman's home and committed violent acts against her. He was soon apprehended, and after his fingerprints were entered into the database, investigators found an exact match with the print found on Jessica's home window. The criminal was identified as 27-year-old Thomas McDowell. Upon learning of the match, Debbie immediately informed the police that McDowell was an acquaintance. She recalled that just a few months before Jessica's disappearance, she had hired him for construction work on her property. During his 2-day stay at her home, McDowell built a shed and repaired the porch. Interestingly, McDowell wore a beard and a tall cowboy hat, which could have led Rebecca, who saw the kidnapper only briefly and in the dark, to mistake his headgear for a wizard's hat, similar to those she had seen in cartoons. However, the police faced the problem of insufficient evidence to press charges. First, the absence of Jessica's body made it impossible to assert her death with certainty. Second, McDowell's fingerprints on the window could be explained by his work at Jessica's home, even though the likelihood of this seemed improbable. Upon examining the house, forensic experts noted that the fingerprint had not been exposed to external conditions, such as weather, that could have distorted it. Moreover, Debbie regularly cleaned the window where the print was found, as her children often came up to it, pressing their hands against it to speak to her, leaving marks that had to be removed. 6 months before the child's disappearance, Thomas McDowell had worked on the family's property, and by the time of the police's inspection of the scene, no other fingerprints besides his were discovered. This indicated that the man was unlikely to have left his print during the work. Debbie mentioned another important point. When Thomas was working for her, she accidentally locked herself out of the house, leaving the keys inside. To get back in, she had to climb through the same window McDowell had watched her through. However, all these arguments did not influence the police, and their opinion remained the same. There was not enough evidence against McDowell. In 1987, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for assaulting a woman in another home. Debbie was devastated by the authorities' refusal to charge McDowell with the kidnapping. That same year, McDowell's cellmate informed the police about Thomas confessing to committing a horrific crime. McDowell claimed he kidnapped the girl from her home in South Carolina, intending to molest her, but when she bit him, he killed her in a rage and dismembered her body with a machete, after which the remains were thrown into a field. When confronted by investigators, McDowell did not deny his actions and offered to give a confession in exchange for immunity, which the authorities found unacceptable. Learning that McDowell had avoided punishment, the cellmate wrote a letter to Debbie telling her everything. Disappointed by the police's inaction, Debbie began her own investigation. At one point, she found McDowell's abandoned car and inspected it, discovering threads and fabric fibers on one of the seats that matched the color of Jessica's pajamas. Despite this lead, the police did not give it proper attention, finding it odd that Debbie, without special equipment and forensic knowledge, could find such evidence. In 1987, another event occurred. Kansas police notified local detectives of a girl matching Jessica's description. Her mother immediately went there, but all hopes were dashed when she heard the child's voice from the corridor and realized it was not her daughter. In the years that followed, Debbie gave interviews criticizing the police's inaction and ignoring the obvious suspect, but it did not lead to significant changes. In 1990, Jessica's story was featured in a popular TV show about unsolved crimes, which prompted new leads, but all led to dead ends. A year later, Jessica became the first child in South Carolina for whom an age-progressed portrait was created. In the early 90s, this was an innovative technology potentially capable of helping identify missing persons as they aged. Nevertheless, the case remained stalled for many years. In 2007, 21 years after the disappearance, Jessica's mother again publicly accused the police of inaction, presenting to the press for the first time the recording of the conversation in which the sheriff talked about the possibility of ending the search. Journalists approached the sheriff, who stated that the investigation had never ceased over the years, and more officers had been assigned to the case after that incident. Debbie also expressed dissatisfaction with the failed attempts to involve other agencies in the investigation, which were each time blocked by the local prosecutor. That same year, a case review was conducted, confirming the lack of sufficient evidence to charge anyone, leaving the situation unchanged for the subsequent years. In 2014, events significantly impacted the local law enforcement system. The sheriff was convicted and removed from office for fraud and bribery, receiving a sentence of 1 year in prison. 2 years later, the prosecutor was arrested for driving under the influence, which led to a DUI with a subsequent hit and run, costing him a $1,000 fine and the loss of his position. In 2021, 35 years after Jessica's disappearance, Sheriff Jay Kuhn initiated the reopening of the investigation, seeking assistance from the FBI's Special Unit for Missing Children. 50 agents were deployed, who began the investigation from scratch, reviewing all available materials and seeking new leads. During the thorough analysis, the team not only confirmed the existence of evidence against Thomas McDowell, but also discovered new indirect evidence of his guilt. Relatives and acquaintances pointed out that immediately after Jessica's disappearance, McDowell changed his appearance, shaving off his beard and hair and abandoning his habit of wearing a cowboy hat, which he had always worn before. It was also noted that McDowell smoked the same brand of cigarettes that were found near Jessica's home. However, attempts to find DNA on the cigarette butts were unsuccessful, likely due to their destruction during the initial analysis in 1986, when forensic methods were not as advanced. These additional pieces of evidence, along with the fingerprint in the cellmate's testimony, were key in the decision to take the case to court. In January 2022, Thomas McDowell was arrested, marking a significant breakthrough in the long-stalled case. At the time, the 62-year-old man refused to admit guilt, leading to prolonged preparation for the trial, which lasted several years. The trial only began in January 2024. Thomas's defense sought to challenge the evidence, arguing that the fingerprint on the window could have been left during his work on the property. They also questioned whether Rebecca could have mistakenly identified a man in a wizard hat instead of a cowboy hat. However, experts called by the prosecution emphasized that the fingerprint was definitely fresh and would have disappeared or changed over time due to weather conditions. At the trial, a former inmate also testified, repeating the story Thomas had told in prison in 1987. The prosecution argued that a person from another state was unlikely to be aware of the case details. Moreover, Thomas had previously expressed a desire to confess to the crime, requesting full immunity from the police. The trial concluded on February 8th, and the jury unanimously found Thomas guilty. The 63-year-old man was sentenced to life in prison. For Debbie, who had been convinced of his involvement from the beginning, the case's conclusion brought mixed feelings. She felt satisfaction that the guilty party was finally punished, but regretted that the arrest could have been made 36 years earlier. This would have prevented the many years Thomas spent free before being held accountable. Nevertheless, Debbie still could not come to terms with the fact that her daughter's remains had never been found. Along with the new police team, she intends to continue the search, although the chances of finding them after 4 decades are slim.